Robert McNamara is one of the most polarizing figures in the history of the Vietnam War. For many veterans, his name is synonymous with the strategic failures and mounting casualties that defined America's involvement in Southeast Asia. As Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, McNamara presided over the massive escalation of U.S. forces in Vietnam, and the war became so closely associated with him that many people called it McNamara's War. But what if the conventional wisdom about Robert McNamara is incomplete? What if the man who publicly championed the war was privately consumed by doubts about its winnability? And what if those doubts emerged far earlier than anyone knew? Brothers William and Philip Taubman spent 15 years researching a new biography of McNamara, drawing on previously unseen personal papers, letters, and diaries that shed new light on one of the most consequential and tormented figures of the Vietnam era. Their book doesn't excuse McNamara's role in prosecuting a war he came to believe was unwinnable, but it does attempt to explain him, to understand the internal contradictions of a man who was simultaneously a fierce advocate for the war in public and a secret opponent of it in private. Stick around. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of The Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host, Michael Crone, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of that conflict more than 50 years later. Episode 105, Understanding Robert McNamara. Right after this.
Hello, I'm Gary Sinise. Nearly 3 million Americans served in Vietnam, and more than 58,000 have their names inscribed on the wall. Those that pay the ultimate price in service to America. Some might ask why the Vietnam War still matters. It matters because more than 58,000 lives were cut short and their families forever changed. It matters because we should never forget how Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home. A lesson learned so that our current generation of veterans are treated with respect. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, the organization that built the wall, works to ensure that future generations will understand the war's impact. I'm asking you to help keep the promise the wall was built on. Never forget. Visit vvmf.org to find out how you can get involved.
Bill Taubman is a historian and retired professor who spent nearly 5 decades teaching political science at Amherst College. He's written acclaimed biographies of Soviet leaders Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev. Bill's younger brother, Phil Taubman, is a journalist who spent 30 years at the New York Times, including stints as Moscow bureau chief and Washington bureau chief. Since retiring from the Times, he's written extensively about Cold War figures and American foreign policy, including biographies of George Shultz and a history of America's spy satellite program. Together, they spent 15 years researching and writing their new book about Robert McNamara. They joined me via Zoom, Bill from his home in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Phil from Palo Alto, California.
It seems to me that either one of you could have written this McNamara book. What do we get when the two of you team up that we wouldn't get if one of you had done it?
Here's Phil.
I think you get the best of both of us. And it turns out that our writing voices are very similar. This might be something we inherited from our parents. The books I've done are at the intersection of journalism and scholarship. The books that Bill have done are predominantly scholarly, but he writes in a very conversational way, as I do. So folks who looked at this book as we were working on it, a number of them said to us, we have no idea where one of you stopped writing and the other began writing.
I think Phil, as a journalist, has more of a nose for news than I do. And I, as an academic, have a focus on what you might call historical perspective. I learned to notice things that looked as if the best way to explain them was to understand the personality rather than the political circumstances around them.
Can you guys talk a little bit about the genesis of this book? What was the spark?
Well, the spark came out of left field, and it was generated by Robert McNamara's widow, Diana, who was his second wife. His longtime wife, Margie, had died quite a few years earlier. He remarried. And then when he died in 2009, he left to Diana an extensive set of materials, and she got interested in them, felt that they were materials that shed new light on McNamara. And she got in touch with a number of people, trying to find someone who would look at the materials and take a fresh look at Robert McNamara. That series of people led ultimately to me when a Stanford professor who's a friend of mine asked, would you be interested in doing a book about Robert McNamara? And I said, why would I want to do that? And he said, well, Diana McNamara's got these interesting papers. So that was the genesis of the book. I went back to Washington. I went to the apartment where McNamara had spent his last years at the Watergate in Washington. She showed me the documents. I found them quite gripping, including a series of letters that Jacqueline Kennedy had sent to Robert McNamara, beginning in the Kennedy administration and then continuing on through the Johnson administration and beyond. There were letters there that McNamara's mother had written to him when he was a young man enrolled at Harvard Business School. And there were letters that McNamara had exchanged in the years early in World War II when he was in the Army Air Corps and was exchanging with his new wife, Margie. So that's the genesis of the project. The year that I went back to look at those papers was 2010. So this project took 15 years to be completed.
At what point did you decide that you'd like to invite your big brother to collaborate on it?
The real heavy lifting on McNamara did not really begin until probably almost a decade after I'd first seen those papers. And by then, I had come to the conclusion that it would be enjoyable and enormously helpful to find a collaborator to do this book. And of course, Bill immediately came to mind. And
yes, and I should add that when I started working on it, and that was right during the pandemic, which was the perfect time to draft chapters because I couldn't travel, I couldn't socialize, I had nothing else to do. So I sat at my desk with the help of documents that we had obtained from Diana McNamara and other things that we had gathered together and began to write. And then Phil, when he saw those, began to edit. And then he began to write chapters himself.
What do you gentlemen believe is the common perception of Robert McNamara, and what would you like them to learn or rethink as a result of being exposed to your book?
My guess would be most Vietnam veterans do not like McNamara, and in fact may hate him, may see in him the man who ran the war for the presidents he served. Indeed, the war became known as McNamara's War, who believed that he ran it in the wrong way, and especially, subjected them to the death toll, which mounted and mounted for no good reason. I think they must be very critical of McNamara. And if they learned from his memoirs that, as he said in his memoirs, we were wrong, terribly wrong. And as he began to apologize, if he did, for his role in the war, they may very well feel that this was news that made him sound even worse. Because if he thought it was terribly wrong, then why the hell did he persist for another 2-3 years in running the war as he did? They may believe, along with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, who called McNamara a computer with legs, meaning a machine rather than a human being, who had no concern for them, for the people who were fighting and dying in the jungles of Vietnam. If that's the case, then our book has something new to tell them. It turns out, as we discovered, that he was both a fierce proponent of the war in public and a kind of secret opponent of it in private. That sounds crazy, but that's what he was. We discovered the secret diary of his top aide at the Pentagon in April 1966. He said, "I want to get the troops out of there so badly that I can hardly stand it." And yet, he continued to preside as manager of that war. So what our book is, it's about that kind of person. How could he be both for the war in public and against it in private?
So you're not trying to recast him in a favorable light. You're trying to more fully illuminate.
Right. We say we're trying to explain him, not to praise him or to bury him, to use Shakespeare's words.
Mm. Phil, anything to add?
I thought of McNamara as a cold-blooded son of a bitch, basically, who prosecuted this war that didn't seem to have any real globally, strategically important goal. And he kept dispatching thousands and tens of thousands of young Americans to Vietnam, where thousands of them died. And I still feel that way after working on this book. But I think I understand McNamara better than I did. I think the flaws in him that we illuminate in the book, the doubts he had about the war, the internal turmoil he felt about the war, the fact that as he was waging war in Vietnam, he was at war with himself. None of that excuses his conduct as Secretary of Defense.
Mm. Phil used the word son of a bitch. It reminds me of a moment late in McNamara's life in the 90s when he was at a conference at Brown University and talking about the war. And during it, a Vietnam veteran in the audience moved over to the stage to confront him and accused him of being a son of a bitch. At which point the security in the hall prepared to move this guy out. But McNamara said, no, let him talk. And as they talked, McNamara said, "You were right. I am a son of a bitch."
Let's walk through a little bit of his background, his childhood. I think one of you referred to him as kind of the perfect Eagle Scout. Can we talk a little bit about those circumstances?
We learned from reading a lot about his childhood, including remembrances by his high school friends and college buddies. His mother, in particular, had driven him to try to excel. She was a kind of helicopter parent in a pre-helicopter age. She kept pushing him. If he got an A on an exam, she said, "Why didn't you get an A+?" She kept pushing him. She kept describing him as brilliant, as having a divine gift. And she was not only telling him this from home, she sort of intervened in his life. She was constantly at his high school arguing with his teachers if they didn't think highly enough of him. And she wrote him letters when he was at Harvard Business School in which she reminded him to wear his jacket when it was cold and to brush his teeth. On the one hand, she was pushing him to be a genius and to be successful beyond belief. And on the other hand, she was infantilizing him by treating him like a guy who needed to be told to brush his teeth. I think the combination of that was devastating in the long run, because what it fostered was, on the one hand, this deep desire to excel, and on the other hand, a level of self-doubt. His father was a shoe salesman and in charge of sales for a big shoe company, but he traveled around trying to sell shoes. His mother, at this point, was not working, but was managing the household and managing her brilliant son in particular. The father was 22 or so years older and very aloof. And at one point later in life, when McNamara's son talked about how his father had never been a real father to him, he speculated that maybe that was because McNamara's father had never been a real father to him. And I think McNamara both resented the way his father sort of ignored him, but also learned from his father to put his own career ahead of parenting his children.
Clearly, he excelled, right? You don't get into Berkeley and then Harvard Business School unless you're pretty excellent.
He was one of 3 students in a class of how many, Phil? 1,500, maybe 3,000 at Berkeley, who were elected to Phi Beta Kappa at the end of the junior year. And at Harvard Business School, he was the #1 performer, a top student in his class.
Wow. Did he excel at anything other than academics? Was he an athlete or a musician, or what were his interests?
Tried to be an athlete. He tried out for the crew, and he was too small. So they made him the cox of the crew.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to learn tennis and golf later on, got to be a mediocre tennis player, but never learned to play golf. He tried to be a fisherman. So he was ambitious. He tried to master everything he touched, and he did.
The one thing athletically that he did excel at was mountaineering. From his college days on, was a devoted mountaineer, spent many, many expeditions in the Sierra Nevada in California and the high Rocky Mountains in Colorado over the entire course of his life. That became his signature physical outing. I think it reflected his personality because he pushed himself to the limit in these expeditions. It was a sign of proving himself as a man that he could hike at high altitude, even when he was in his 80s. He was also an accomplished downhill skier. So after the war broke out,
which war are we talking about?
World War II. At this point, there is no United States Air Force. There was the United States Army Air Corps, which turned into the Air Force in 1947 after the war. And as the war began after Pearl Harbor, the folks in charge of the Army Air Corps, General Hap Arnold and others, realized very quickly that they needed to do a lot of statistical analysis so they could understand the state of the Air Corps fleet of planes. They could understand the effectiveness of bombing raids in Europe and Asia. And they turned to Harvard Business School, actually, to help train a group of statisticians who could then go to work for what was called statistical control, or stat control, at the Army Air Corps. Stat control, the commanding officer was a fellow named Tex Thornton. And Tex figured out they're teaching statistics and statistical analysis at Harvard Business School. Let's go up there and get Harvard Business School to become a training ground for Army Air Corps stat control, which they did. McNamara signed up early, and after a while grew impatient with helping to train people to go work in the Army Air Corps and volunteered to go himself. Eventually he did, and he was shipped overseas to Asia, to Europe, where he played a role as a leading statistician and analysis of data. He actually got involved in the planning for the firebombing raids on Japan. And that's something that also tormented him later in life, because looking at the data about flights, he concluded that the altitude at which the planes were passing into Japanese airspace was too high for effective bombing. It was high enough to provide some security to the pilots and crews. And so he was recommended that they come in at lower altitude. The biggest advocate of lower altitude attacks was the commander of the forces in the Japanese raids, Curtis LeMay. And so McNamara helped Curtis LeMay plan those devastating firebombing raids on Tokyo. And long after that, long after the Vietnam War, during the filming of The Fog of War, a film about McNamara's role in Vietnam, McNamara said during those interviews, you know, if we had lost World War II, we, meaning he and Curtis LeMay, probably would have been convicted of being war criminals. So that's an important phase of his life to understand. And it was out of the Army Air Corps work that he wound up at Ford, because when the war ended, Thornton had a smart idea. He said, look, I've got all these brilliant young statisticians. Why don't I get a group of them and offer our services collectively to some American companies that are trying to gear up now for post-war activities? And they sold the idea to Henry Ford, the son of the founder of Ford Motor Company. And lo and behold, he brought all 10 or 12 of them up to Detroit and put them to work. And that's how McNamara actually got started at Ford Motor Company. This would have been right after the war. By the time we got to the late 1950s, he had risen to the very top of the ranks, and in 1960 was named president of Ford Motor Company, making him the second most powerful executive there under Henry Ford Jr.
And also the first non-member of the Ford family to be the president of the Ford Motor Company.
Wow. I mean, that just seems awfully quick, right? You said that at the end of the war, so I mean, we're talking about less than 15 years.
Yeah, less than 15 years. But, you know, it's a little bit of a sidelight. Ford came out of World War II in terrible shape, like all the big car companies that had converted to wartime construction of tanks and other weapon systems. As the war ended, the reconversion to peacetime production, Ford had no idea what it was doing. It was losing money hand over fist. GM turned around fairly quickly, I think Chrysler as well. And Ford struggled. So, you know, the Ford who was running Ford Motor Company desperately needed help and figured out maybe these guys who came to be known as the whiz kids could help him put Ford Motor Company on a sounder footing. And McNamara got a lot of credit for that, hence his very swift promotion.
He had also developed during the war a kind of more commanding style. He had learned from the generals under whom he worked closely to be tough and strong and decisive. And while that had positive effects at Ford, there were also plenty of people at Ford who began to resent that kind of leadership, as if he was too commanding, as if and we have descriptions in the book of how he would prepare for meetings as if he were studying, you know, for a PhD. He would imagine in advance everything that would be said by everybody there and by him, and he would let others go first, you know, when a question was to be answered, and then after they had tried, he would correct them with his answer, which had been prepared all along. So by the time he left, there were a lot of people there who were glad to see him go.
So he wasn't president of Ford Motor Company very long.
No, just about 6 weeks. before John Kennedy called and invited him to Washington.
Now, how does a guy who grew up the son of a shoe salesman in Oakland get a phone call from John Kennedy?
A lot of important people who had met McNamara when he was president of Ford were impressed by him. People who had the ear of the top people in the administration. And I should say it wasn't Kennedy himself who made the first phone call. The secretary of Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law, who was helping Kennedy to recruit. And we describe the phone call and how Shriver says, the president would like to nominate you as Secretary of the Treasury. And McNamara says, no, I'm not qualified for that. And then Shriver says, well, then he would like to make you Secretary of Defense. And McNamara says, no, I'm not qualified for that either. And then Shriver says, well, the least you can do is come down to Washington and talk to the president. So McNamara goes down to Washington, and with a little bit of convincing, which we also describe in the book, he agrees to be Secretary of Defense.
I think, Michael, one of the explanatory factors here is that he had, by this time, developed a reputation for being just unbelievably brilliant, just off the charts smart. I think that's part of what drew the attention of the Kennedy recruiting group. And
they were looking for whiz kids.
They were looking for whiz kids. And I think they mistook him actually for a Republican because he came, what do you expect a president of Ford Motor Company to be as a Republican? He actually was a Democrat. But Kennedy was looking to populate his cabinet with a couple of Republicans. And let's not forget the Harvard connection. Kennedy went to Harvard. George Bundy, whom he brought in as national security advisor, had been the dean of the faculty at Harvard at a very young age. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who came to Washington as a senior White House aide, was a Harvard guy. There was a kind of Harvard orientation to John Kennedy, and I think that may have played a role too.
Okay, so when he became Secretary of Defense, what year was that? It had to be 60 or later, right?
61.
61. Yeah. So, it's another 5-6 years before we really get deeply involved in Vietnam. Do you guys discover anything surprising about those 5 or 6 years and how he thought about Vietnam and what his position was on American intervention before it actually happened?
So I think there are a couple of points here. One, let's start with Vietnam. Kennedy was lukewarm about getting involved in Vietnam. He was killed before ultimately having to make a pivotal decision whether to get more deeply involved or not. There's a debate that continues to this day, speculating about what he would have done. But what you see with McNamara is a guy who comes into office and is focused on administrative reforms and budgetary reforms at the Pentagon, not really focused on Vietnam. And very early on, there is a very telling encounter with Kennedy where McNamara comes in and basically makes the case for expanding the American footprint in Vietnam. At the time, there were just a small group of American military forces there acting as quote-unquote advisors. And McNamara comes to the meeting and makes the case based partly on the domino theory, namely that if Vietnam falls, so will Malaysia and Thailand and the rest of Southeast Asia, and then communism will spread even beyond there. He makes the case, and Kennedy expresses doubt about this outcome. It becomes clear that Kennedy is basically an agnostic as to whether the United States should get involved in fighting a war in Vietnam. And instantaneously, on the spot, McNamara changes his tune, which leads one of his friends who had observed him over the years to note, and we quote this in the book, that he was very good at reversing course to do whatever it was that his boss wanted him to do, even if it was in conflict with what he thought should be done.
And do you think that that is simply respect for the office, or do you think it's deeper than that?
Oh, I think it's probably both. It's respect for the office. You see that in presidencies, one after the other. Once you get into that Oval Office, if you're a presidential aide and the president, you defer to the president. That's true today. It's been true, I think, through the history of the presidency. But I think it also reflects a kind of McNamara kind of desire to please that goes beyond just deferring to the president. But that said, let's not forget that the early years as defense secretary were primarily devoted to reforming the Pentagon, which he did exceptionally well. And to this day, the reforms that he instituted at the Pentagon remain in place by and large. After the Defense Department was created, civilian control was there more in name than in reality, because the military services and the service chiefs were really running the Pentagon and deciding independently what their budgets should be. Each of the services had advocates on the critical committees in Congress who supported those requests. And so you ended up with redundant weapons programs. You ended up with secretaries of defense who really didn't control the Defense Department.
So he made the Pentagon more accountable to civilian government?
Absolutely. And, if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara would be remembered, admired greatly for the transformation of the Pentagon that he led. So he was a radically transformative figure at the Defense Department during the Kennedy administration. McNamara was a giant in reforming the Pentagon.
And so how does the assassination change his trajectory, professionally or personally?
Profoundly, I think. And you can see it in a number of ways. I think the way I would summarize it is that he went from working for a president, JFK, whom he admired greatly, a president who had a sense of humor, a president who regarded McNamara not only as an effective defense secretary, but who came to admire him as a friend and part of his social circle, a president who forgave him for his mistakes in a very gracious way, a man who he himself said, and I think it's true, that McNamara really loved John F. Kennedy. And in an instant, he's now working for a gruff, tough, deal maker president from Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a man whose interest in intellectual issues is secondary to his interest in the exercise of power, a guy who was quick to demean and patronize his aides. LBJ would invite his top aides into the toilet with him as he took a shit and expected them to stand there talking to him while he was doing that. So the transition for McNamara couldn't have been more dramatic, and it was exacerbated on the day of the assassination when he went out to Andrews Air Force Base to be present for the return of Air Force One, carrying now President Lyndon Johnson, carrying Jackie Kennedy still in her blood-stained red suit that she was wearing that day, and the body of JFK. And so he went out there, and then after the plane returned and he accompanied Johnson to the White House, he returned later in the evening to Bethesda Naval Hospital while an autopsy was being performed on Kennedy, and spent the night in the sort of presidential suite atop the Naval Hospital with Jackie Kennedy still in that outfit and other members of the Kennedy family. And as he described it, he sat next to Jackie for the entire night. She was sitting on a stool, apparently at what I guess would have been a kitchen counter. McNamara was seated on the floor, and he listened to her all night. repeat over and over again the ghastly details of what she had witnessed and experienced. And it was that night, I think, that his closeness to Jackie grew and her closeness to him. And so the assassination was a turning point in many ways for Bob McNamara. Johnson focuses on running for president in his own right in 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin episode takes place in 1964, and that led Johnson and McNamara very quickly, despite the clear and bulletproof evidence of an attack by North Vietnam. It led them to go to Congress and get almost unanimous approval in the House and Senate for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was really the authorization from Congress to go to war. It was not quite a declaration of war, but it was close. 1964 was a campaign year, and Barry Goldwater was opposing Johnson. And Johnson figured out, we can make this guy look like a warmonger that will help my candidacy. And in fact, they did. Again, people will remember the very effective ad of a nuclear bomb going off that was used to sort of imply that if Goldwater was elected, the United States would end up in a nuclear war. So it wasn't really until 1965, Johnson's now in the presidency in his own right, he won an overwhelming landslide victory, that the issue of Vietnam comes center stage. And it comes center stage largely at the initiative of McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who decide that the equivocal American role in Vietnam needs to be addressed by the president, and that they believe they're at what is later called the fork in the road memo that they produce early in 1965 that goes to Johnson and basically says, we can't go on the way we are with this kind of half-baked role we have in Vietnam. Either we got to go in big time, which is what we favor, George Bundy and McNamara said, or we got to figure out a way to get out. It was that memo that began the discussions that led later that year to the decisions to make an American war in July of 1965 by sending hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. McNamara was the primary advocate of that escalation, along with the military commanders in Vietnam, William Westmoreland and others.
After a short break, Bill and Phil Taubman talk about McNamara's final decades, his efforts to reckon with his role in Vietnam, his unexpected friendship with Jackie Kennedy, and the question that tormented him until his death. Stick around. If you're enjoying Echoes of the Vietnam War, I want to let you know about some very easy ways you can help to support the podcast. Here are 3 ideas ranked from easiest to hardest, and the hardest is still pretty easy. Number 1, spread the word. Tell a friend or 2 friends, or better yet, share a favorite episode on your social media accounts so you can let all of your friends know in one go. Number 2, leave us a review or a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Even if you stream Echoes directly from our website, you can still send feedback through the form at the bottom of the page. Number 3, if you're listening from our website, consider following or subscribing on one of the many platforms where podcasts are found, including Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and many more. That way, you'll always have the most recent episode automatically downloaded to your mobile device, and you'll boost our subscription numbers, which will help new listeners find us more easily. Thank you so much for just listening. We really appreciate your continued attention to these stories. We'll be extra grateful for your help in spreading the word about Echoes so more people can check out the work we're doing. Let's talk about the wall for a minute. It is widely considered to be the memorial that changed memorials forever. Its design invites a level of engagement, of introspection, of reverence that no fountain, no statue of a cannon or a man on a horse could ever match. The volunteers who work there often talk about wall magic, that unexpected, often spiritual connection or discovery that happens when you visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's one of the reasons why the wall's design has inspired so many other memorials around the world. Of course, there is one little problem with the wall's design. 140 panels of polished black granite aren't exactly portable. So, unless you can get yourself to Washington, D.C., how are you supposed to experience wall magic for yourself? Well, guess what? We already thought of that. In 1996, VVMF unveiled an exact replica of the wall that could be packed into an 18-wheeler and hauled to cities and towns all across America. Since then, the wall that heals has been displayed in more than 800 communities throughout the nation, spreading the healing legacy of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to millions of visitors. Sure, there are other versions of the wall that travel around the country, but the wall that heals is the only one that is an exact replica of the one in Washington, created and maintained by the same organization that built the wall in the first place. And not only that, the wall that heals is accompanied and curated by VVMF employees who work with host communities to ensure that the experience is as close as possible to the real thing. And that includes wall magic. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out episode 15 of this podcast to learn what happens to people's hearts when this traveling exhibit rolls into a real-life American community. The Wall That Heals and the mobile education center that travels with it will be in Clovis, California, October 9 through 12, and American Canyon, California, October 16 through 19. To see the rest of this year's tour schedule and to learn how you can bring the Wall That Heals to your town, visit vvmf.org. And now back to my conversation with Bill and Phil Taubman. When we left off, we were talking about the summer of 1965, the moment when McNamara became the primary advocate for a massive escalation of American forces in Vietnam. I asked Bill and Phil how much of that advocacy was just sober strategy and how much of it was something else in McNamara's personality.
I think he was trying to be the perfect advisor in a situation in which all the other advisors wanted the U.S. to do more and to send troops. I think in the spring and summer of 65, he still believes it. And he's just making the best possible case for it. Although when he got into the White House with Johnson and all the others who were arguing strenuously for more troops, ground troops in Vietnam, he went along with it.
I think the relationship between McNamara and Jackie Kennedy is fascinating and something that readers of the book will find amplified in the book. It's an unexpected relationship, I think, to most people who were around in that era, like Bill and me. These are unlikely people, it would seem, given their reputations at the time, to have had a close relationship. And it played out against the backdrop of the war. Jackie Kennedy was a fierce opponent of the war, but they became very close friends. The war she opposed it, and it all came to a kind of very dramatic moment. At one point, he was visiting her at her apartment in Manhattan overlooking Central Park. They sat together on a sofa in the library of her apartment, and she grew quite agitated about the war and literally pounded him on the chest with her fists pleading with him to end the bloodshed. And as he later said in some interviews that were conducted by Brian Vandermark and Peter Osnos, he, recalling this incident, said that he too was frustrated by the war, but he didn't know what to do about it. That's a kind of tragic statement for the defense secretary to say in retrospect. Clark Clifford talks about this pivotal presentation at the White House about escalation in 65, in the summer of 65. He says that the case that McNamara made, he'd never heard such an extreme version of the domino theory, so extreme that it extended not only through the fact that communism would sweep across Southeast Asia, that it would ultimately have a ripple effect in India and in Turkey and even in Africa. Clifford was kind of stunned. It's like, where did that come from? But that was what McNamara's advocacy was like in July. And then 9 months later, he's talking to his aide about how he just is dying to bring the boys home from Vietnam.
Are there some key points that we want to make about the war itself and McNamara's role in it?
I think it's fair to say that McNamara tried, within the strict limits of remaining as the Secretary of Defense, he tried to accomplish several things. One was to start negotiations with the North Vietnamese, and he was involved in supporting or even initiating various attempts by other people with connections in North Vietnam, like Henry Kissinger was one of them, who had mounted an effort to start negotiations. He was also involved in McNamara, in efforts to limit the war. That is, he was doubtful about bombing. He sort of knew on the basis of World War II that bombing does not eventually turn the tide, doesn't change the attitude of the people who are fighting the war. They continue to fight, maybe even harder, after they get bombed in places like Hanoi or Haiphong Harbor.
It was a revelation to me to realize that the escalatory course that Johnson and McNamara took in Vietnam was actually a moderate course in their view, that they thought they were operating in a way that would avoid the kind of wild escalation that they thought the Joint Chiefs were recommending, that would get to the point where we would end up in a nuclear exchange with China or the Soviet Union. So it's odd to think about, going back to my days as a student journalist at Stanford, watching the anti-war protests, thinking that the escalations in Vietnam were just incredibly misguided and dangerous. I didn't understand at the time, and it really took this book research for me to come to the realization that, at least in their minds, Johnson and McNamara thought that they were waging a measured war rather than a maximum. It's interesting to see how over time his efforts within the administration to limit the war, even as he was continuing to prosecute it, that this obviously came to the attention of Johnson, who I think very quickly came to realize that McNamara was no longer on board the way he had been in 65. McNamara and Johnson began to wonder how he could push McNamara out the door. He came up with the perfect solution, which was to make him president of the World Bank, which was a sideways move. It was not a decapitation. On the day that McNamara learned about the decision, he was incredibly agitated. He picked up the phone, called Tom Johnson in the White House, who was an aide to Johnson, and asked Tom Johnson, "Was I fired?" He repeated the question, and the answer, of course, was yes, he had been fired. but he wasn't sure exactly what had happened.
One of the things that is new that you guys have discovered in your work on this book, that he came to believe that the war was militarily unwinnable. So 2 questions on that. Can you summarize why he came to believe that? And secondly, talk about the documents that you guys discovered that illuminated that.
Yeah, I mean, what led him to come to the realization that the war was unwinnable militarily was in part his own trips to Vietnam. And what's so kind of heartbreaking about that, Michael, is that he would go to Vietnam, he would see that things weren't working, and he would come home and he would get off the plane at Andrews and hold a little press conference and say, everything's going great, we're doing well, we're making progress. It was these continual lies that he would express after his trips to Vietnam. But he actually told the truth. He went up to Harvard in the fall of '66 to meet with Harvard faculty. He got a very rude welcome by Harvard students. It was a kind of tense moment. Eventually, he made his way safely to a room where he could talk candidly with Harvard faculty members. And McNamara tells the Harvard faculty about the village pacification program in Vietnam, which was to some extent, in theory, the heart of the American effort in Vietnam, pacify the villages. You know, through pacifying the villages, we can deal with the Viet Cong. This was a path to victory to some extent, not the only one, but it was a way of winning the war. In the room with Harvard faculty, he says, we haven't pacified a single village in Vietnam. So it was that kind of realization that led McNamara to understand that the American strategy in Vietnam was insufficient. McNamara talks in his own book about his doubts as time went on. And there have been other very good earlier books about McNamara, several published in the mid-1990s. But I think what we're doing in our book that is different is making so crystal clear the deep doubt that he had about the war as early as the fall of '65 and through '66 and '67.
I would just say that having reached that conclusion, he never brought himself to tell Johnson that directly. Throughout the 2.5 years that he remained as defense secretary, and that later tormented him. He asked, why didn't I do it? Why didn't I mobilize the people I knew to make that case? And he could never fully understand it.
He ended up a broken man. He spent the last decades of his life trying to come to grips with what he had done. I think that the presentation of those last years in the last chapters of our book will be a revelation to a lot of people, because that's never really been written about very much. It's both heartbreaking in a way to see a man struggling mightily to come to grips with what he did, trying mightily to understand history in which he played a decisive and terribly destructive role.
If I may read from the last 2 paragraphs of our book.
I love that. Yeah.
He rejected a funeral or memorial service, and he said, instead of that, heaven for me will be to remain in the hearts and memories of his family, as warm, as close as we were in life. I will hope as well to see others continuing to pursue the objectives I have sought, however imperfectly at times, to move the world toward peace among peoples and nations, and to accelerate economic and social programs for the least advantaged among us. Those are his words, and this is our last paragraph. It is true, more than any other political leader we can think of, Robert McNamara admitted his grave mistakes in the hope of helping others to do better than he did. But the final ironies of his life are that many who continued to pursue peace among peoples and nations and to help the least advantaged among us have been no more successful than he was, and that what remained in the hearts and memories of his children may be warmer and closer than was the case during some periods of his life.
Our thanks to the Taubman brothers for such a thoughtful and illuminating conversation about one of the most complex and controversial figures in American history. Their book, McNamara at War, A New History, is available now at bookstores everywhere and on Amazon. But all three of us encourage you to support your local bookstore if you can. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more stories of service, sacrifice, and healing. See you then.